Welcome back to Module 2 of Motivation and Emotion. So as I mentioned in the last lecture at the end, today our Module 11.2 is going to cover sex. So we're going to talk about motives for sex. So a question that we might want to examine is, why do humans have sex? Obviously we know that one of the main reasons for sex will be reproduction, but we also know that a lot of people have sex when it's not for reproductive purposes. And so researchers have been asking themselves this very question, and they've asked hundreds of college students, and several themes have emerged as the results of that research. So the motivation to have sex naturally has a complex underlying physiology, so to do with your body and kind of your physical responses. Your initial response to encountering a person that you deem attractive comes from what we call your libido. So your libido is the motivation for sexual activity and pleasure. Although, obviously, like I mentioned, the main evolutionary purpose of sex would be reproduction, sexual motivation is actually expressed in many different ways. So we can use interviews and questionnaires to basically ask people about their sexual motivation and their reasons for having sex, but other methods include physiological measures and even direct observation, which sounds kind of weird, but there have been a lot of really interesting studies done in terms of sexual motivation and kind of what's going on during the sexual response cycle. So Alfred Kinsey was one of the very first researchers to tackle the topic of human sexual behavior. You can see here 1953, so that was long before talking about sex openly was acceptable. It was considered very taboo at the time. And so basically he was a zoology professor, and he began his research by interviewing his own students about their sexual histories. So by modern standards, we would say his methods were flawed and controversial, but his work on sexuality continues to influence research on sexual behavior and motivation. So he was kind of ahead of his time in many ways. So contrary to the conventional thinking of the time, he actually believed that heterosexuality and homosexuality fell on a continuous scale. And today we obviously have changed the methods that we use to study sexual behavior. We're no longer kind of taking our students out of university and studying them. And instead we tend to use anonymously completed surveys that may contain larger and more representative samples. So for example, two researchers named Meston and Bust, they surveyed more than 1,500 students, and I'm going to show you some of their results that they came up with. So these are the self-reported reasons for having sex as given by undergraduate students in that study that I just mentioned. The first main reason was for physical reasons, so either the person's physical appearance turned me on, or I wanted to achieve an orgasm, anything that has to do with physiology. The second would be to help attain a goal, so wanting to get a raise or wanting to hurt an enemy, whether it's a kind of a positive or a negative goal, any sexual behavior that was performed to kind of try to achieve a goal would be kind of included in that category. The third was for emotional reasons, so realizing that they were in love or wanting to intensify a relationship. That would be another of the kind of major reasons reported for having sex. And then fourth is because of insecurity, so either feeling obligated to, you're in a relationship and you feel like you have to have sex with your partner, or you kind of want to be nice, you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. We're not saying that all of these reasons are good reasons for having sex, but these are just some of the reasons that were reported in that research by the college students who were surveyed. So as you can see from that figure, physical, personal, and social factors underlie sexual motivation. Physical reasons tend to be related to the pleasure of sex itself, while many respondents actually reported using sex for instrumental or emotional reasons, so to gain something or to kind of connect emotionally. Responses differ depending on relationship context, and age was also seen as a factor in sexual motivation. So we have seen that despite popular belief that older adults don't have sex anymore, the motivation to have sex does continue throughout the lifetime. It may decrease in some people over time, but in general, we don't just kind of become non-sexual beings at some point in our life automatically. So this is some results of research discussed in an older textbook that we used to use, but I like to bring them up because I think it's a kind of comprehensive list. It kind of goes along with a little bit of what we talked about from that study we just mentioned. And so this was basically the amalgamation of results from a bunch of different studies. And we can see that several major categories of motives for sex have emerged. So the first could be pleasure, so either satisfaction or physical pleasure. The second relates to intimacy, so feeling emotional closeness or spiritual transcendence. The third has to do with insecurity, so wanting to be reassured of attractiveness or desirability. The fourth relates to partner approval, either desiring to please or appease a partner or to avoid anger or rejection. The fifth basically relates to peer approval, so trying to impress friends or be a part of the group or conform, well, everyone's doing it, why aren't you? And then number 6 would be attaining a goal. So either, and we kind of mentioned this before, but maybe getting status, to get money, to get revenge, any type of kind of motivation that involves fulfilling some kind of goal would be kind of in that category. And it was actually shown that, interestingly enough, men and women didn't differ in terms of the amount of them that endorse intimacy as a reason for sex, but men more strongly endorsed all other major categories that were kind of illustrated through the research. So this is just kind of a little interesting survey that you can kind of do on your own time if you'd like to see where you score relative to the norms. So it's basically just an attitudes towards sex survey. So you can respond to each of these items by either assigning it a score of 1, which would be strongly agree, to 5, which would be strongly disagree, and just in terms of how you feel about each item on the list. And once you've assigned the number to each, you can average your responses, and you'll see at the bottom here it'll show you what kind of the average responses overall were, so you can compare yourself to the groups of people who've completed this type of survey and research. And you don't have to do it, but it might just be interesting for you to kind of see where you fall. Now we'll talk a bit more about physiological measures of sexual motivation. So our physiological and psychological motives for sex are obviously not separate. There's kind of a combination of the two in pretty much any case. But the sexual arousal, the biological components, can influence what we pay attention to and how we respond to it. So there were 2 researchers named Masters and Johnson. There's actually a TV show based on them because they were, again, one of the other really highly influential names in terms of very early studies into sexual behavior and sexual motivation. So they performed one of the earliest studies of sexual behavior in the 1950s, and they based their human sexual response cycle, so they came up with this concept of a 4-stage sexual response cycle, on their observations of 27 male and 118 female prostitutes. Participants were monitored for heart rate, blood pressure, and blood flow to the genitals, so pretty invasive research, and Masters and Johnson's follow up this study with observations of hundreds of men and women to characterize the physiological changes that occur during sex. So essentially what they found, and what they kind of took all of their results and it kind of pointed to for them, was something known as the sexual response cycle. So this sexual response cycle describes the phases of physiological change during sexual activity, which is comprised of 4 primary stages. We have excitement, we have plateau, we have orgasm, and then we have resolution. And so this cycle does apply to both male and female responses. Generally, they will kind of follow the same order, although there are differences between sexes in terms of experience and duration of each stage. So one major topic was how males and females differ in their patterns of orgasm. So despite the fact that male and female orgasms are technically physiologically very similar or the same, women are far more likely to report not experiencing orgasm than males. However, men, despite the fact that they kind of reach orgasm kind of more consistently, they usually experience a single orgasm followed by a refractory period during which erection and orgasm are not physically possible, while some women experience multiple orgasms with no refractory period. So overall, men tend to be more likely than women to experience orgasms, but women actually have the ability to experience multiple orgasms without kind of a break in between. So I guess there's kind of pros and cons on either side there. So here are just some examples of sexual response cycles. So you can see A kind of illustrates the male sexual response cycle. You've got excitement, plateau, orgasm, and then resolution. Whereas in B here, we basically see that women tend to have like a more varied sexual response profile than men. So we've got a few different examples that females could potentially kind of illustrate. So line A shows a woman who has multiple orgasms. You can see it kind of, the line goes up and down towards the end. Line B is a woman who doesn't experience orgasm at all, so she never quite reaches that high peak. And line C is a woman who has a single orgasm and then kind of enters that resolution phase. So we do see kind of more variation in terms of female sexual response cycles. As you've probably heard, the hormone testosterone is very responsible in terms of promoting sexual desire in both sexes. It is an androgen, which is another name for a masculinizing hormone, and it is produced by both males and females, but definitely larger amounts in terms of male production. This fact, the fact that we know that testosterone is heavily implicated in sexual desire, has created a market for the illegal use of androgens, and it's the logic behind chemical castration of sex offenders. So essentially, sometimes with sex offenders, they will cut off the genitals of the sex offender in order to kind of try to prevent them from reoffending, and what they figure is that if the male no longer has their reproductive organs, they will no longer be producing high levels of testosterone, and that will decrease their sexual desire. However, we have seen that efforts to increase or decrease desire using testosterone often fail. And it's important to note that the symptoms of androgen deficiency are also those of depression or marital problems. So just because somebody, a male in particular, doesn't have a high sex drive, it doesn't mean that it's due to low testosterone. It could be due to a variety of other purposes. And so even though a lot of people kind of buy testosterone supplements and things like that, they're not always going to be as effective as one might think. There's also no real consensus on how much sexual activity is not enough. So, in order to say, okay, well, you need to increase your amount of sexual activity, well, how much is enough? Is it one time a day? Is it one time a week? Is it 5 times a day? There's no real kind of, hallmark there, or like a specific benchmark that you should be meeting. And in the same way, there isn't really any kind of set level of testosterone that somebody should have. So there's not really an agreement on the difference between abnormally deficient and normally low levels of testosterone. Finally, hormones and behavior travel a two-way street, and sexual motivation involves more than just hormones. So just because you have an influx of hormones doesn't mean that you're going to engage in sexual behavior. So that can involve things like social experience and the context as well. So it is important to note that despite the fact that people have tried to use, testosterone supplements and things to increase sexual desire and to help with their sex life, it can be very dangerous, and it's not very well regulated and generally not supported by research evidence. Now we're going to talk a bit about sexual orientation. So sexual orientation, as you probably know, refers to the consistent preference for sexual relations with either members of the opposite sex, which would be heterosexuality, members of the same sex, which would be homosexuality, or members of either sex, which would be bisexuality. So current definitions of sexual orientation focus on the psychological aspects of sexuality rather than the behavioral criteria. So this is important because it's important to note that somebody can have a sexual orientation without ever actually having sexual intercourse or engaging in sexual relations with somebody. So you can know what sex you're attracted to without ever having engaged in sexual behavior. There's a great deal of research evidence demonstrating that homosexuality is common in many species. One of my favorite stories is actually about a pair of penguins who wanted a baby so badly. They were male penguins and they kind of bonded, and as you may know, a lot of penguins will mate for life, and so these two male penguins, they decided that they were each other's life partner, and they wanted a baby so bad that they would literally sit on rocks and try to kind of hatch a child, and they were given an egg, that had been abandoned, and were able to kind of sit on it and then raise the chick as their own. So it is something, homosexual behavior is something that we see occurring in many, many different species. Psychologists have long struggled with finding a satisfactory explanation for variations in sexual orientation. I'm not really going to get into that here, but for example, Freud and Ellis and Ames, they all had their own ideas about, why variations in sexual orientation occurred and what they mean in terms of your psychological and social factors. There's a neuroscientist named Simon LeVay, and he actually found an area of the hypothalamus that was on average smaller in gay males. But we must be careful in interpreting results such as these because it could be something that's environmentally impacted as well. We've also used brain functioning studies to try to show differences in brain functioning according to one's sexual orientation. And these types of studies have actually shown us that sexual stimuli elicit different patterns of activity in heterosexual and homosexual individuals. So for example, smelling sweat of the sex that you're attracted to versus the sex that you're not attracted to, you actually see different responses when it's to the sex. I know this is kind of disgusting research, but when it's sweat from the sex that you're attracted to. Same thing with viewing pictures of genitalia. So we actually see activation of reward centers when people are kind of looking at genitalia, pictures of genitalia of the sex that they're interested in, and in bisexual individuals, they will actually show activation to genitals from both sexes. So sexual orientation may also be influenced by a combination of genes. There does seem to be a lot of evidence to suggest that approximately half of the individual differences found in sexual orientation are due to genetic factors, at least for men. There's actually been some really interesting research done here. For example, there's one study, and I don't think it's mentioned in this textbook, but there have been studies that have found that the number of biological male children a woman has, as that number increases, so as she has more biological male children, the chances of her next biological male child being homosexual increase substantially. And it's kind of odd research, but it has, we have seen different associations like that. So there definitely seem to be some genetic and kind of physiological prenatal factors there as well. And here's just kind of a graph that shows you a little bit about genetics and sexual orientation. So again, like I was just mentioning, we do seem to show, at least for males, that there are consistently higher genetic correlations for sexual orientation. So it does seem to indicate to us that male homosexuality has some kind of genetic basis. However, when we look at results comparing female identical and fraternal twins, we don't see as consistent results. So it's not really certain whether genetics play such a large factor in terms of female homosexuality. And then we have a really cute picture here that just kind of goes through a bunch of the different species in which homosexual behavior has been observed. So we've seen it in bonobo chimps, in koala bears, bottlenose dolphins, and sheep. Actually 8 to 10% of rams show preference for mounting other rams. So it is kind of really interesting to see that, it clearly is not something that's unnatural. It's something that's found in a lot of places in nature, and it's something that you're born with. You don't choose to have a particular sexual orientation. I think that's really important to note because there's a lot of misinformation about that. So now I want to talk briefly about transgender and transsexual individuals. So the term transgender essentially refers to individuals who experience a mismatch between the gender that they identify with and then their biological sex that they were assigned at birth. Transsexual refers to the subset of transgender individuals who wish to permanently transition from their birth sex to the gender with which they identify. Now, these are the definitions given by the textbook. I've often heard transgender used to refer to both. I mean, I know that transsexual in this definition is supposed to be kind of a subset of transgender individuals, but in my understanding, the majority of people who consider themselves transgender do have at least some amount of wish to transition to the sex, to the gender that they feel that they are a part of. And so transsexual individuals may seek medical assistance with sexual reassignment surgery. Researchers have now begun to investigate whether there are brain-based differences between transgender individuals and the rest of the population. And it has been suggested that sex hormones, so for example testosterone, influence the differentiation of genitals in the first 6 to 12 weeks of prenatal development, while sexual differentiation of brain structure begins to occur during the second half of prenatal development. So it seems like a lot of the changes that would lead to individuals identifying as transgender or transsexual later in life do occur before birth, and I guess to quote Lady Gaga, or to paraphrase, it really does seem like, people are just born that way. So it is something that, again, has a biological basis and is a very natural thing that can occur, and if individuals choose a transition to live the life that they choose, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So consistent with this view, researchers have found that the volume of some nuclei in the hypothalamus of male to female transsexuals resembled female rather than male brains, and that the brains of females transitioning to male differ from those of male to female. But we must be cautious with the conclusions. Of course, this is very preliminary research, and we still have a long way to go in terms of kind of examining these relationships. Unfortunately, transgender and transsexual individuals do face many struggles in our society with respect to stress and discrimination, but in an effort to counter these negative effects, organizations such as the Canadian Psychological Association have produced literature aimed at helping transgender individuals deal with these negative emotions. So we do recognize that people who are members of the LGBTQ+ community in general, unfortunately, are a target to heightened levels of discrimination and stress with respect to cisgender individuals, but there are a lot of great resources out there that can really help alleviate some of the stress and help those individuals find a sense of belonging. So finally, we're going to talk a bit about human sexual behavior in terms of cultural influences. So although we'd all love to say that people should act any way that they want, of course within reason, we're not saying you should be able to go out and kill people or do anything crazy like that, we are all influenced by gender roles. So gender roles are basically defined as the accepted attitudes and behaviors of males and females in a given society. So basically the things that, when you think of somebody being kind of a typical male or a typical female, the things that you associate with those roles, that would be aspects of those gender roles within our society. And they differ from, culture to culture and from continent to continent in a variety of ways, but each society does have its own kind of understanding of gender roles and what's involved. However, across generations, there have been significant changes in male and female sexual scripts, and sexual scripts are the rules and assumptions about the sexual behavior of males and females in that particular context, so typically in that particular culture or particular society. For most of human history, we did see that male sexual behavior was based on competition, whereas females were taught to focus on developing stable relationships. And although it may not be stated, the male sexual motivation to have sex with a large number of women still exists. It's not as readily acceptable in our society these days, but it is something that is still very prevalent, and that may be partly due to higher testosterone levels in males. So a question we might have is, why do you think that sexual scripts have been changing? So why do you think kind of the rules and considerations about what's expected of males versus females and their sexual behavior in each society have been changing over time? There are three particularly important explanations that exist. The first has to do with the emergence of the women's rights movements over the past 130 years. So for a long time, unfortunately, women in our society were kind of perceived as possessions more so than people. They were the property of their husbands, and the husbands could do with them as they wished. And before they were married, they were the property of their fathers. But of course, in the past 130 years, women have made really great strides in terms of gaining their independence and being perceived as actual people rather than possessions. And so that has led to a lot of changes in terms of what's expected of them and the rules that they have to kind of follow in terms of their sexual behavior. The second is the increasing presence of women in the workplace. So with women actually getting their own jobs and engaging in the workforce, that also meant that they were able to have some measure of economic independence and were able to kind of take care of themselves. So that kind of, again, changed the way women were viewed and kind of the ability they had to take care of themselves and to kind of act in whatever ways they saw fit. And then finally, the pill. So basically, we're referring now to kind of birth control and the fact that women can use birth control, particularly, things like the pill, which are the solely kind of based on the action of the woman, taking that pill every day. And they can use those methods of contraception to gain control over when they become pregnant. And so that was, again, something that was very empowering for women and allowed them to kind of make a lot of their own choices in terms of their sexual behavior and who and when and where kind of they engaged in sexual behavior with. So it's important to note that not all women or men follow the same sexual scripts. Different ethnicities and religious groups have their own scripts as well. So even within, society, there can be different subsets of the population that follow different sexual scripts. For example, researchers have found that women born in China but living in Canada report more conservative sexual attitudes and lower levels of desire in general. And we'll talk now about why that may be. So this may be due in part to sex guilt. So sex guilt is basically negative emotional feelings for having violated culturally accepted standards of appropriate sexual behavior. So unfortunately, this is something that's still very prevalent in a lot of different cultures and societies, kind of feeling guilty for having engaged in, sexual behavior that wasn't kind of culturally appropriate. These differences appear to decrease for individuals who become more involved in mainstream Western culture. So if that sex guilt is something that was kind of a part of a previous culture or previous kind of society that the individual is engaged in, as they become more accustomed to Western culture and maybe kind of assimilate a little bit more into Western culture, those feelings of guilt do tend to decrease. And finally, we do see that sexual scripts also exist in homosexual relationships, but they appear to be more flexible than in heterosexual relationships, perhaps because many homosexual individuals do not follow gender roles to the same degree. So in general, individuals who are in homosexual relationships, they tend to be a little bit more free in terms of how they express themselves. They don't really tend to adhere to those gender roles as tightly. Finally, I'm going to talk very briefly about sex and technology. So in the past 2 decades, electronic media such as the internet, instant messaging, and social networking sites have become common outlets for sexual expression. So there are a lot of activities involving technology, such as viewing porn, online sex, and even meeting people online and then kind of meeting up with them offline for sexual purposes. So an estimated 1 in 3 adults today has engaged in some form of cybersex, and about 75.6% of university students use the internet for some form of sexual entertainment. Obviously, these encounters result in a lower risk of pregnancy and STIs when compared to kind of traditional physical encounters, but they may still have their dangers. So people tend to communicate with less inhibition when they're communicating virtually, which can open up the possibility for impulsive behaviors such as sexting. So regardless of your opinions on cybersex, it is something that's becoming increasingly common in our society, and many of its impacts remain to be seen. So there's a lot more research to be done in that field to determine kind of some more specific impacts and what the kind of more long-term impacts might be on sexual behavior and relationships in general. And that is it for our module on motives for sex. So hopefully you learned some interesting information here, and next time we are going to talk about motivation to belong and motives to achieve. So I will talk to you in the next video.